Some people are going to think like, this dude's not eating vegetables. He's going to fucking die.
Right.
He's eating red meat. Red meat is bad for you. He's going to have a heart attack. He's going to die. And so let's talk about that. Let's, because a lot of people are probably thinking that like, this is a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. And that's what the mainstream tells you. And that's what most physicians will tell you. And so that's why I wrote the book. So in the Carnivore Code, you'll find the beginning of the Carnivore Code is an evolutionary story about our brains and how they got to be really big over the last 3 million years. And you can look at anthropologic evidence of the onset, the advent of hunting correlating with that. We talked a little bit about the plant toxins. We can revisit that. That's the second section of the book. The third section of the book is debunking all these myths about red meat and all of these myths that red meat is going to harm you in any way. So there's tons of chapters that go into more detail about this.
Let's fucking debunk.
Let's debunk the shit out of it.
Yeah.
So when you really think about this, most of what you are being told about this, most of what the listeners are hearing is based on epidemiology. So we have to understand what epidemiology is and how that's different than interventional research. We talked a little bit about the importance of research earlier in this podcast. Epidemiology, the vast majority of studies that you, the listener, hear about on the news, which is where most people get their information about health these days, or that your doctor is reading about nutrition, are epidemiology. You and I lamented early in this podcast how hard it is to do good nutrition studies. And it's so hard to do good nutrition studies that are interventional because who's going to benefit from the funding? That most of what's been done over the last 100 years is epidemiology. This is observational research, which has a value, but we cannot overemphasize or conflate the value of epidemiology too far or conflate it with something different than it really is.
Well, because everything's conflated, like
exactly.
You're saying like these people are eating meat. Well, they're also eating, McDonald's as their primary source of meat and a bunch of candy, but they're eating a lot of meat.
Exactly.
There's so many fucking things in a lifestyle. If you're not controlling the variables, it's very little that you can get from it without really looking with a detective's eye.
And you cannot make a causative inference. So you cannot say correlation is not causation. Most people have now heard that, but this is what it means. That these studies are giving people surveys. They're taking 100 or 1,000 or 100,000 people and giving them a survey that says, how much meat did you eat? Or how much pork, how much chicken, how much steak, how many eggs, how many cigarettes, how much McDonald's, how much of all these things. They usually don't break it down with the junk food like that, but how many of these foods did you eat over the last 10 years? So it relies on a number of things. It relies on memory. People tend to underreport the amount of junk food they've eaten and overreport the amount of health food they've eaten because they want to please the interviewer and you're being asked. Nobody's going to say like, oh, I actually ate McDonald's 6 times a week for my whole life, right? Because everybody kind of knows when you have to write that on a survey, that looks horrible. Why would I make such a bad decision? They're embarrassed about that. And furthermore, exactly as you're saying, correlation is not causation. What do we know? Epidemiology tells us about the prevailing narrative in the culture in which these studies are done. And there's a very big difference in the research findings between epidemiology done in Asia and epidemiology done in the United States over the last 50 years. So let's just think about this. In the United States, what have we been told your entire life, my entire life, our parents' entire life about red meat? It's bad for you.
Heart attacks.
Heart attacks. What should you eat? Vegetable oil, canola oil, margarine, right? Like low fat. Basically your whole life, except the last 4 or 5 years with this keto resurgence, most mainstream messaging has been that red meat is not good for you. So
lean protein.
Lean white meat protein, right?
It's the leanest.
The leanest protein.
The leanest you can get.
No saturated fat.
Nope.
So who eats red meat in that sort of a climate? People who are rebels. People who also smoke and drink and don't exercise and don't go in the sun, don't get prostate exams, don't get mammograms, are a lower socioeconomic status and ride motorcycles off cliffs, right?
But bro, if you take steroids and you eat chicken breast and asparagus every meal, you will get jacked.
You'll get jacked.
That I know for sure.
You may get jacked.
Because I've known some people who've done that. That's like the bodybuilding diet, right? It's so funny. Like bodybuilders will come up with some argument about this. Like they'll eat the same fucking thing over and over. It'll be like tilapia and broccoli and this, and they'll eat it every single day and cans of tuna. And I'm like, okay, yeah, cool. How do you feel? Terrible. Okay, cool. And then what else? Are you on steroids? Like, yeah. Like, yeah, okay, sure.
What do your hormones look like?
For sure, you'll get stronger if you do that.
How big are your testicles?
That's not a testimony to what a proper nutritional fucking plan is,
Right. Muscles are not indicative of health, per se. Like we know that, and we know anyone that's been in the bodybuilding world or figure world knows that most people who do this will end up with complete hormonal catastrophe.
Diverticulitis, some other fucking awful thing will
Horrible,
happen.
horrible things, right?
Yeah.
And so this is not the answer. But who eats red meat over the last 70 years? People who are rebels. This is what we call unhealthy user bias, right? When you go to if somebody goes to a barbecue and eats red meat, do they only ever eat just red meat? Hell no. They eat coleslaw. They eat a Coca-Cola with it. They're going to have some birthday cake. So this and who doesn't
At
eat
least
red
some beer.
Right? Some beer. But who doesn't eat red meat over the last 70 years? Who's a vegetarian? People who are health conscious because they're listening
Doing
to
yoga.
Yeah.
They're getting sunlight.
Playing tennis.
They're fucking sunning their butthole. They don't even know if that's good for them or not.
Perineum sunning. Right?
They're getting it in there, though.
They're getting in there. They get mammograms. They get prostate exams. They're more likely to be of a higher socioeconomic status because, let's face it, vegetables are freaking expensive, right? Like nobody's going to spend money on fucking kale when you could get a Big Mac for $2. I'm going to spend $2 on a head of kale or $2 on a freaking Big Mac. Like, done. Right? Yeah. Nobody's spending money on kale if they don't have some income, right? So this is the healthy user bias, the fact that vegetarians and vegans tend to have healthy activities. They do more exercise, right? They do the unhealthy behaviors less. So epidemiology in the US is confounded by this on both sides. You have people eating meat being unhealthy, people eating vegetables or shunning red meat being healthy. And so what does the epidemiology look like sometimes? The people that eat less red meat are healthier, the people that eat more red meat are unhealthy. Problem solved. News headline, red meat shortens your life. Except it's correlation. Now, one study or a number of studies that I discuss in the book that you will never hear about in the evening news were done in China or Asian countries. Over 200,000 people in both of these studies. And what did they find? They did the same sort of thing. How much meat do you eat? What are these other foods do you eat? They found that the men who ate the most red meat have the lowest incidence of cardiovascular disease. And the women who eat the most red meat have the lowest incidence of cancer. So what are you telling me? Red meat is bad for Americans, but good for Asians? We're that genetically different? That's completely false. That is not true. That is not a defensible position scientifically. The narrative is different. What's the narrative around red meat in Asia? People who eat red meat are affluent. People who eat red meat are affluent. If you eat red meat, you are of the upper class in Asia.
You're a baller.
You're a baller. You're crushing it if you're eating red meat. So, not surprisingly, people that eat red meat do better. So what does epidemiology tell us? It tells us about the narrative in a country. It doesn't really tell us good or bad, plants, meat. We can't say anything about that.
Right.
But what it can do is help us generate a hypothesis. So we look at the hypothesis in the US. People that eat more red meat have worse health outcomes. We say, my hypothesis, my guess is red meat causes bad health outcomes. Let's make an interventional study where we take people and we replace, this study's actually been done, it's one of the references in my book, we're going to replace 200 calories of carbohydrate in their diet with 8 ounces of red meat a day. So they're doing an interventional study. This is actually a study, okay? This is an experiment. And they're going to follow them, I think it's a 10-week or a 12-week study. So they gave people 8 ounces of red meat per day and they removed 200 grams of carbohydrates, okay? Or 200, I forget how many, something like that, 200 grams of carbohydrates, giving them 8 ounces of red meat. What do they find? There was no increase in inflammatory markers and they trended down. So anyone that says that red meat is inflammatory, I would challenge them to show me a single interventional study that proves that in humans, because they don't exist. And yet, plant-based advocates, the evening news is going to tell you right and left, red meat is inflammatory. And it's based on epidemiology. It's not based on interventional. And we have interventional studies to show that red meat and animal protein does not raise inflammatory markers.